Welcome to the second session of the 2020 Cambio de Colores webinar series. My name is Veronica Perez Picasso, and I'm the Cambio Center Coordinator. Today's presenter is one of our keynote speakers that will present next year at the Cambio de Colores conference in St. Louis. To present her and to moderate at this session, I'd like to welcome one of our Cambio Center board members, Corinne Valdivia. Thanks, Corinne.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Veronica. Before I introduce our plenary speaker today, I have some announcements to share with you. Don't forget that tomorrow, Friday, at 1:30 Central Time, we will have a panel 2, Political Participation and Policies in Local, State, and National Levels. Other reminders are that the 2019 proceedings are available online now, so that you can actually download them from our last year Cambio de Colores conference. The other thing that we had asked some of the presenters for this current year that now we're doing remotely was ask if they were willing to do some video presentations, and so they have, and these will be available next week, both at the Cambio site as well as the Cambio de Colores websites. We will have additional video presentations posted by June 19, Friday of next week. And the idea is that people can go back and look at the panels and today's plenary speaker. The Cambio de Colores in 2021 will take place in June 16th through the 19th in St. Louis. And so those are the announcements for today. We ask that our audience, please keep your microphones on mute. And please submit your questions through the chat. And we will try to cover them as many as we can today. Our keynote speaker today is Dr. Lizette Ojeda from Texas A&M, who will be speaking about conducting culturally competent qualitative research with Latinos and immigrants. Dr. Lizette Ojeda is an associate professor at Texas A&M University. She has published in the intersection of work and mental health among Latino immigrants, including a widely cited best practices article, Conducting Culturally Competent Research with Latino Immigrants. She has been recognized as a top contributing author in the Journal of Latinx Psychology, where she also serves on the editorial board. As a bilingual licensed psychologist, she has worked with Latino immigrants and has given her expert witness testimony for an asylum seeker case. She's also a proud daughter of Mexican immigrant parents. Not included in this short bio is the fact that Dr. Ojeda was at MU doing her PhD as we were beginning in Cambio Center to do our first research on Latinos and rural communities. And we were lucky to have her during that time because she was working with us doing focus groups, especially with women immigrants in 3 places in Missouri. And it was a really great experience. She facilitated those, and it was amazing in terms of the things that we were able to learn, but more amazing, these were focus groups in which at the end of the session, we were all crying because of all the shared stories. So I have my Kleenex just in case, Lizette. So without further ado, I want to make sure that Lizette has all the time to present and you have all the opportunity to ask questions from her. Thank you for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you today. I'm sorry that we couldn't do this in person, but I'm excited about it for next year. Gosh, the presentation that I'm going to give today is based on an article that I wrote with my colleagues about 10 or more years ago. And so much has changed since then. that I'm really excited to talk about some of the main things that I think will always be really relevant in working with Latino and Latinx immigrant populations. See, that's one of the things that has changed. The article was called Latino Immigrants, and now we went from Latino to Latino A to Latin with the A, and now we're Latinx. And so we need to be on top of the changes, the political climate, how our country shifts in the way that it views and receives immigrant populations from Latino America, and also the experiences that Latino immigrants experience with research, because we don't want to create a bigger barrier between us as researchers, as academics, as belonging to an ivory tower, with the community that we want to serve, that we want to understand, that we want to provide a voice to. And in order to do that, no matter how well-meaning you are, how well-intentioned you are, you must be culturally competent enough to be able to do it. Good intentions are not good enough. That's the bottom line. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen because I have a presentation for you all. Okay. Alrighty. So, like I mentioned, we're talking about culturally competent, qualitative research with Latinx immigrants. I'm still getting used to it, you guys. My students keep telling me it's Latinx. So, all right, let's get started. So I want to build up a case for why qualitative research in the first place versus quantitative research. It's great. Quantitative research is really important. Mixed methods is awesome as well. There's something about qualitative research that really gets to the core of understanding the Latino, Latinx experience among immigrants. You have to think about cultural values, which I will get into, but it really allows for this intimate experience to understand what is their lived experience. And that's something that no survey can capture fully. Let's see. The thing though is that we have to recognize that the process of doing the research is just as important, if not more important, than the actual study outcomes. And the reason this is the case is because if you do not approach the participants in a culturally competent manner, if you do not capture the cultural nuances that are being revealed during the data collection process, it's not going to reflect accurate or data that fully captures their true lived experiences. It's going to be data that reflects more of our assumptions, our experiences, our book knowledge, not really what's going on with the people that we're studying. So that's something that I really want to put a lot of emphasis on, that the research process is just as critical, if not more, than the research findings themselves. And so with that said, I want to talk about the importance of the research team composition. So most people would think that it's enough to just have somebody who is good at conducting qualitative research, someone who is good at leading a research team overall, somebody who maybe speaks Spanish, but that's not enough. The research team has to be comprised very intentionally of several different people with diverse backgrounds. And the reason for this is because this is the group that's leading the project. This is the group that has a lot of say on how you recruit participants, what kind of questions you ask them, how you pivot between the semi-structured interviews that you are conducting, making sure that you're not missing any information that might not be obvious to you, okay? And so some of the things that I want you to think about are, not only having the qualitative research expertise, and there's a lot of variation within that in and of itself, like there's semi-structured interviews, there's focus groups, there's all kinds of different methodology, right? So that's one thing, having those technical skills. And then you also want to make sure that you have an interdisciplinary team. I remember that when we did our research projects through the Cambio de Colores, through the Cambio Center, that was something that was really important. We had people from psychology, I think maybe even sociology, very diverse. And that's going to allow us to make sure that we don't have any blind spots that are hindering our ability to really do a good job with our research study. Because you have to remember that we're working with a very vulnerable population. There's not a lot of research out there on Latinx immigrants in the first place for a variety of reasons, right? Anti-immigrant sentiments, a disconnection between academia, researchers, and community members, mistrust between Latinx immigrants and people who are in government or academic positions. And so when we have the opportunity to gain their trust and to learn about their lived experiences and provide an outlet through our journals, through our presentations, like at the Cambio de Colores conference, we want to make sure that we are doing as good of a job as possible so that not only our participants have a good experience with this research process and feel like they've actually contributed to something beyond themselves, something that's important, something that's going to live on forever, this knowledge, right, that they're helping us understand. And one of the best ways to be able to do that is to make sure that you have an interdisciplinary team that can come in and see different areas that are really important, economics, right, things like that. The research team also has to have a genuine interest in the voices of Latinx immigrants. So, you know, there's a lot of research on university students, right? And yes, there are researchers who are genuinely interested in student development, right? But there is also a lot of people who might use students as a convenience sample. And what I want to say with that is that you have to actually have a genuine interest in understanding the needs of Latinx immigrants. It's not a convenience sample. It's not just a group of people that you want to make feel that they're in a vulnerable place, that maybe they're being taken advantage of, especially if you're providing incentives, right? You want it to feel like there's a genuine interest in hearing their voices, that they're not just numbers, because that is going to come across in the interactions. And I'll get to that in a little bit as well. And so interest is great, but you also have to have the expertise on Latinx immigrant populations. And if you are leading a research team and you're trying to bring on interdisciplinary experts, you have to keep in mind that someone who studies Latinx population in the US, who were born in the US, that is not going to be the same thing as the experiences of Latinx immigrants, because it's a totally different experience. Yes, some of the traditional cultural values are there, and research shows that cultural values like familismo tends to persist throughout generations, but the things that they deal with are different, like immigration status, right? That brings in a whole different piece to the puzzle of understanding what their lived experiences are. So just because somebody is part of the Latinx community and researches Latinx people, you got to make sure that it's specific to Latinx immigrants. The research team will flourish more if it is comprised of members from diverse ethnic backgrounds. And what I mean by this is not just people from with a Mexican background, not because it's the predominant Latinx group in the US, but people from islands, people from South America, Central America, especially when you think about who are the participants that you're going to be working with. You want to make sure that if you're going to be working with Central Americans, well, then it makes sense to have somebody who understands the Central American lived experience on your team. Now, there's a caveat there. We don't want to make assumptions that just because you are from a similar background that you can be the spokesperson and know everything about people's experiences just because they're from that background. But it does help a lot to have a diverse team that can maybe understand some cultural nuances that aren't easily understood in other Latin American countries. Like, there are so many different ways to say one word, and in one ethnic group it might be offensive, while in the other it might not be. And so those are things that we would want to pay attention to that would be more easily addressed if you have a diverse group of team members. And you also want to think about different generational statuses. I know in previous teams that I've been on, it's been very fruitful to have someone who was born in the US, someone who's second generation, who understands the experiences of immigrants because they were a child of immigrants, but also immigrants themselves. That's something that's going to be really important, to be able to have a team that is representative of diverse generations. And then we also want to make sure that there's not only team members who are going to be bilingual, but bicultural as well. Because it's one thing to be bilingual and fluent in Spanish, but not actually have lived the experience of what it means to be Latinx, and vice versa. You can be bicultural and, be very, have a very strong sense of ethnic identity and be very connected to traditional Latinx culture and values and beliefs and customs. But if you're not bilingual and fully bilingual, to be able to read and speak and translate. Now, you don't have to expect that you will have someone who can fit all those boxes. You can have several team members who are able to take responsibility for different pieces of that, because otherwise we'd be looking for a unicorn for a very long time, and we've got work to do. So that's something that I definitely want you to keep in mind, that it's not just about the language piece, it's also about the cultural experience piece. This is going to show up in how you decide to design the study, the type of questions you ask, how you ask them, how you interpret the words that your participants share with you, how you translate them into the English language that still captures the essence of the meaning. And then also how you interpret the data. Okay. The other thing that's really important is cultural awareness, knowledge, and skills. So let's start with cultural awareness. What do I mean by that? Well, we have to be very aware, self-aware, and this can be a place that gets vulnerable, because we have to be open to checking ourselves, checking our biases, assumptions. One of the questions that I ask team members is, when you think about the people that we're wanting to understand what it's like to be like them, when we want to understand a particular phenomenon, what picture comes to mind? And you'd be surprised to see how biases show up in just the stereotypic image of what this person looks like, what their socioeconomic status is, what their literacy level is, what education level is. And so that exercise there can really open the doors to having a real conversation about how might our assumptions show up in the way we approach our participants, in the way we recruit them, in the way we talk to them. How might it show up in the way that we inherently demonstrate our power because we're in a position of authority as researchers, as academics, as people who have degrees, if we're working with a low-income Latinx immigrant population, for example. So being able, you as the leader of a research team that's going to study Latinx immigrants, being able to lead your team to have these difficult conversations, because it's the foundation. And it's going to come back up when you're analyzing the data as well, as you're having discussion about the different themes that have emerged, for example. So you want to set that from the beginning. Knowledge. Obviously, there's so much that we can always be learning. I mean, I've been studying this stuff for a long time, and there's still more that I have to learn. That's never going to end. But being very familiar with some foundational elements of the Latinx immigrant experience, like immigration journey, right? Reasons for immigration as a whole, with different communities. Policies in countries of origin. Cultural values, which I will go over in just a minute. Those are some things that you would really want to have a strong foundational knowledge of to be able to work with this population. And then book knowledge is not enough. You actually have to know how to apply it. And what I recommend is that you take a tiered approach where someone who is leading the team have not just the awareness, knowledge, and skills, that somebody who maybe has gone through the awareness process and has knowledge, but hasn't had the skills, that you take an apprentice model where they're able to shadow you, or they're able to observe you in the field doing this work. And then having a debriefing meeting to be able to talk about, what did you see? What was that like? How is that different than what you have learned? It's kind of like trying a medical student who has read how to conduct surgery, trying to do surgery. They've got to work under somebody's wing first. Okay, so when it comes to culturally competent recruitment, you have to be aware of where are the people that I want to learn from hanging out. Where do they feel safe? Where do they feel comfortable? Where can I reach them in a way that they won't feel like their safety is at stake? One of the key things with this is to build strong relationships with gatekeepers, people that Latinx immigrants trust. And these could be community leaders, it could be leaders in church, it could be in health centers where that caters to primarily Latinx immigrants. And don't assume that you have read the stuff and you know what to do. Talk to them. You will be surprised with how much information that you will get that we don't find in our books. And so building that partnership is going to be really important, and because when you have the gatekeepers, the community leaders, people that Latinx immigrants trust, then that is going to be a gateway for you to be able to build trust with them better and faster. Some of the places that you would want to consider recruiting at are churches, maybe radio stations, restaurants, places where Latinx immigrants frequent, in addition to getting, being partnered with gatekeepers who can share information at their congregation, with their community, maybe post flyers in their area where it's visible for their community members. So I want to talk about traditional cultural values and how they play a very important role in conducting culturally competent research with Latinx immigrants. So personalismo is a cultural value that is really foundational to the interactions that you will have with Latinx immigrants. It affects everything. It affects how they feel around you. It affects the degree to which you're able to build rapport and trust, and the information that they're willing to share with you that may be difficult for them. And so this is so core. I cannot emphasize this enough. And so what might this look like? Well, it would look like not just doing business as usual. When you're on a call for the first time, trying to see if this is a good fit for them to participate in, if you're answering any questions that they have. Not just getting down to business, but building a connection, having some empathy and showing that you have a genuine interest and desire to create a platform where their voice gets to be heard. And so this takes a shift in how we typically navigate the workplace, right? Our academia, it's more of an individualistic, time is precious, get down to business type of environment. But with collectivist communities like Latinx immigrants, we really have to nurture the interaction that we have with them, because think about it, we're asking them to reveal oftentimes very personal, private things that, at least in my experience, they've told me that they've never shared with anybody. And that's because I deal with more of the psychological stuff, which can be pretty vulnerable. Okay, plática. So basically that means small talk. And this is something that in more individualistic cultures is seen as non-essential, but it really is. And so this is something that starts before the research process starts, in terms of before the interview, before the focus group, before the actual interaction as you're collecting data. It starts with a phone call. It starts with a presentation that you give at the end of a congregation. It starts with the connection that you build with gatekeepers. And so this is going to help Latinx immigrants feel like they're more than just a number, that they're not being taken advantage of, because you take a genuine interest in seeing how their day is going. So engaging in plática and small talk is going to be really important. The other thing that you have to think about is the importance of family. And this is something that frequently shows up in plática. And so oftentimes we, as people in an individualistic country, for the most part, we tend to ask each other, how are you doing? But with many Latinx immigrants, what they might tend to say more often than not is, how are you and how's your family? I have heard in other cultures that that's intrusive, but in the Latinx community, it's not. It's seen as actually caring not just about you, but as a group of people, your family that you represent. And so asking about their family would be something that would be culturally congruent. So not just asking them, how are you, but how's your family? If you go and do research at their home, paying attention to pictures that they have hanging on their walls, and actually showing some interest in their family, in the people that they care about, because then they'll feel cared about too. And some people might think that this is intrusive, but we're talking about building rapport here and using our emotional intelligence to be able to establish that connection and trustworthiness with people who have been taken advantage of for far too long. Then we also have to think about respeto, which is the cultural value of reverence to authority and elders. And because you are a researcher, you have inherent power. And so being mindful of how that might show up in the work that you're doing. It can be as nuanced as wondering what to wear. And that has been a discussion that I've had with my research team. Should we wear jeans and a t-shirt? Or should we wear clothes that shows that we are legit and we are researchers, right? Which one is going to help or possibly harm the rapport that we're trying to build? And what we have found from our experience is that dressing like approachable, normal, everyday people is what has worked for us, at least. Being in a suit and tie, that's intimidating. Business casual could be a little bit better, well, a lot better, but probably not as good as just coming across as someone who genuinely is down to earth and is open to hearing about their story. Because you don't want them to feel like you might judge them based on the difference in social class, education level, occupation. Okay, so those are things to keep in mind. Another thing that can be easily missed is the use of language when addressing Latinx immigrants. So there's a difference between you and you in Spanish. You're probably like, what are you talking about if you don't get what I'm about to say? And so usted is like the respectable you. It's the way that you address someone whom you want to show that you have respect for, that you don't have a previous relationship with. And so you want to, show that you are being respectful. Tú is something that is used more often with people that you are familiar with, where there's not like a professional relationship or someone who is of similar age, peers, coworkers, that kind of thing. And what I find is that when I start with usted, they oftentimes tell me, oh no, tell me tú, dígame tú. And that's a huge sign that they feel safe and comfortable with you, that they have let down, remove this barrier of between you two, okay? So I would recommend that you err on the side of safety, of showing respect, and then giving them the opportunity to allow you to say tú, if that's what they feel more comfortable with. And then there are some other terms, like especially the difference between señora and señorita. You want to be careful with that one, and not assume that a married woman is a señorita, or that an older single woman is a señora. And people can interpret it differently, but basically, señorita implies that you're pure and you haven't been married. Señora is more of you, I don't even know how to say this, because everybody, honestly, whenever I have dealt with this in my interactions with Latinx immigrants, it has been interpreted differently. And so what I would say is just stick to usted to be on the safe side. Don and doña are for people that are older. There's often an element of wisdom attached to these people that you are in interaction with. So as you can see, it's pretty complex. The other thing that I want you to think about is, how should they address you? And so they might initially say usted. And if you want to maybe decrease the power differential that they might perceive toward you, you can invite them to say, oh, you can call me tú. Me puede decir tú, you can say that. And just giving them that option build a stronger trust in you. But if they don't want to use tú, don't insist, because they just might not feel comfortable, and that's okay. But the fact that you are giving them that option says a lot to them, and it means a lot. Okay, then we have fatalismo, which is fatalism. And this is really important, because what I found is that when you're asking questions in your interviews, focus groups, you want to be very careful when you talk about things that are unfavorable. Because some people might feel that if you just voice a potential scenario, that it might come true. And so you want to be very careful about that. And so, for example, if you ask something like, what would you do if you lost your job? Let's just go with that one. They might have a very strong reaction because they don't want that even said. They don't want that to happen, because that would be devastating. And so being very careful about saying things that would be very difficult for them to deal with. You know, like even a question like, how do you think you would handle if a family member was, you know, went to jail and, you know, was caught by immigration? You want to be very careful about that, because the type of response that you're likely to get is, ay, Dios mío, no lo mande, meaning, oh my gosh, like, don't say that. I don't want that to happen. And so a workaround that I have found that is very helpful is saying, I don't wish this upon anyone, but I'm wondering what are your thoughts on if something like this would ever happen? Or saying something like, God forbid this, but I'm wondering, so having it be more tentative, more in theory rather than saying it in a more direct way. And so that's something that you have to be really careful about. And the response that you get with that might vary depending on country of origin, level of fatalism. Some people are more fatalistic than others. This is really important here, because none of these cultural values that I'm talking about are black or white. There's a variation from very traditional adherence to not at all. Okay, and so people vary on different dimensions of cultural values to different degrees. It's so complex and it's so beautiful, and it needs to be studied by us so that we can understand better, right? So maybe people who are more spiritual or religious, this one might be more difficult for them to work with in terms of asking questions that are difficult, right? So keep that in mind. All right, gender roles. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. You have to keep in mind traditional gender roles, because we have machismo, which is the traditional stoic way of being that's very stereotypical, and more recently we have come up with the term of caballerismo, which represents more of the chivalrous side, the one where you work hard for your family and put your own needs last, and take care of your family no matter what, and do a lot, sacrifice a lot of things. And then we also have Marianismo, which is the traditional Latina cultural value of being like the Virgin Mary, pure and self-sacrificing. And again, there's a range of how much somebody adheres to these different values. But what I want to say about this specifically is that I found it very interesting when doing interviews with males and females. So the thing I want you to think about is, how might you want to pair up participants with researchers? If you have a male participant and a male interviewer, for example, think about some of the things that might come up. Let me give you some examples. The male participant might feel like they have to prove themselves as a man, that they have to be strong, and that they have to show that they don't have any vulnerabilities. At the same time, though, on the flip side, being paired with another man might open up more opportunity for them to be less filtered, less censored. Whereas if a male is paired up with a female researcher, they might feel more open to express emotion, if they feel that they can be more vulnerable around a woman than a man, and are less likely to be judged. At the same time, though, they might be more self-centered, censored. They might not want to be rude or vulgar or talk about things that are not caballero-like. Make sense? And so you have to ask yourself, what kind of information do I really need to get here, and how might the dynamics impact that potentially? Because there's a lot of variation here, right? We don't want to make assumptions about just because somebody is male or female that this is what their experience is like, but you want to be familiar with some of these traditional cultural values and how they tend to show up. Okay, so I want to talk about incentives. And I believe in providing incentives. I believe that Latinx immigrants have been taken advantage a lot. There's lots of cases where they don't get paid for their labor. And so if we're in a position to be able to compensate them for the rich information that they share with us, we should do so. The interesting thing, though, is that in my experience, I have found that when the interaction, the interview, the focus group community that we offer to Latinx immigrants, they're so thankful to have been given this space to have their voice heard, to recognize in focus groups that they're not the only ones, to learn about other people's stories. They get so much out of this that when it comes time to offer the incentive, a lot of them have not wanted to receive it. And if you think about it, that can be a really difficult place to be, right? Because on the one hand, you want to compensate them for the gifts that they have shared with you. But on the other hand, you don't want to impose your power over them if they don't want to take the money, if they don't feel like they worked for it, right? A lot of things that I've been told is, I didn't work for it, I was just talking. Solo fue una plática. It was just a talk. And so for Latinx immigrants who are used to work, meaning hard labor, this could be very difficult. So you want to think about, how do you want to handle this? And so one of the things that we've done is we tell them how much we appreciate their work, and this is their way of giving, this is our way of giving back. But if they don't want to receive it, then some options are have them take it, but give it to a church or another family in need, or donate it to someone. And what we have found is that has worked really well. They're like, oh, that's a great idea. And so I urge you to think outside the box when it comes to working with Latinx immigrants. So that's an example of that. When it comes to informed consent, you have to remember that you're presenting a paper to them. And with this population, you know, they might feel on guard because they don't know what they're signing, especially if there are some literacy level differences. And so you want to make sure that obviously the language that you choose to explain the informed consent to them makes sense. You also want to be able to provide it in both English and Spanish in case English is not their first language. You also don't want to just assume that they can read it all without having any questions about the academic lingo that is included in it. So being able to vocally explain to them what this is about, the limits of confidentiality, anonymity, what information you'll be collecting, how it will be used, who will have access to it, that it won't affect, their, it won't get back to their employer or their landlord or immigration, right? Getting a certificate of confidentiality would be really important. That's something that National Institutes of Health provides, and letting them know what are their rights and how you will protect the information, how you will store it, what you will do with it. You're not going to publish it with their name. They get to make one up if they want, or not provide a name at all. Giving them all these options, because it's easy to assume that they know what we're talking about when we are immersed in it pretty much for the majority of our career, right? And so being very clear with that and allowing them to ask questions. Sometimes they might not feel like asking questions because they don't want to come across as questioning you, or maybe even come across as not knowing what you're talking about.
You have 3 minutes.
Got it. Okay. The interview. Okay, where was I? What was I going to say about this? I'm going to forward some. Okay, I want you to read this, and I want you to think about, what in the world does this mean? So it doesn't make sense at all, really, in English, but it makes a lot of sense in Spanish. And basically what this is, it's a literal translation from a participant that I interviewed that said that they had to work with their shirt on right. Trabajar con la camisa bien puesta, which means, literally it means this, what I am showing you, but what it really means is that they want to work with their shirt on right, meaning I want to represent my company. I want to represent my employer. I want to represent my family right. I want to show up with integrity. And so if you think about it, if you only know Spanish, but don't really understand cultural nuances, you would completely miss something like this. It would make absolutely no sense to you. And so this is just an example of how important having someone who understands these cultural nuances is so important. Okay, so I want to tell you a quick little story about a lesson that I learned early on. And no matter how confident and competent we are, when we're inside a bottle, we can't read the label outside of it, okay? We're too close to it. And that's something that happened to me. For research participant recruitment, I came up with a brilliant idea years ago that I would go to a flea market and rent a little spot there and create a big billboard and just put it there with chairs and tables that said this: attention men, because I was studying immigrant men from Mexico. Receive $10 cash for 30 minutes of your time. Are you a man, an immigrant from Mexico? All you have to do is complete this questionnaire anonymously, and you get $10. Guess how many people showed up to my booth? 0. And I'm sharing this with you. It's now I can laugh at it, but back then I was devastated because I'm like, how did I miss this? How was it not so obvious to me? And it's because I truly wanted to help, that I didn't realize that I was putting them in a vulnerable position to be identified as someone who's an immigrant. Maybe somebody's passing by who might assume that they're undocumented and now their safety is at stake. So thinking about these things, and like I said in the beginning, good intentions is not good enough. And so this was a huge lesson learned. And obviously I pivoted and I had a great, experience learning from this and published research on this now. But that was a huge mistake. that I made, because it was basically putting the spotlight on them. And as immigrants, a lot of times that's not something that they want. So now what? What do we do here? Well, I want you to think about, what is it that you bring to the table when it comes to conducting culturally competent research with Latinx immigrants? What is your specialty? Is it being able to translate? Is it being able to capture cultural nuances? Is it being able to establish that connection during the interview process? What's your role? I want you to think about that, because everybody can make a huge impact in this collective community of us wanting to elevate voices that have been pushed down for far too long, and especially in anti-immigrant political spheres, right? That's really important. So I want you to think about that. How can you contribute to us providing this space to gather their experiences as Latinx immigrants in the US in 2020, so that we can then share their message, share their experiences, and have their voices heard. Thank you very much. So that is all I have.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lizette. There's so many comments that you probably will enjoy reading. But let me read very fast a couple of questions. There is, Lizette, please define Latinx as versus Latino, Latina. Are there intergenerational self-identity differences when demographic information is collected in research? Are people provided a choice to self-identify, or there are assumptions that everyone is Latinx now? Because of the different generations, we all didn't grow up with the idea of being an X. We were one, other, or somebody else. So that's how do we address that? That's a question that Sal is posing.
Yeah, this is a very controversial area. That's my timer. It's very controversial. But what I would recommend is, instead of labeling people, ask them, how do you identify? Some of them will say Hispano, some of them will say Mexicano, Boricua. Ask them, how do they identify, instead of putting a label on them?
Yes.
Because that's perpetuating exactly what we're trying to prevent.
And that's how we need to also inform and educate the Census Bureau, for example. Yes. For people that are not Latino or Latina or Hispanic, what do you recommend? Do all your recommendations fit if you're coming from a different culture in trying to work with Latinos?
Yes, they do. And I think that if you are not part of the Latinx community, then making sure that your team is comprised of people who would be able to address all these areas that are really crucial. Having someone who's bilingual, bicultural, conducting the interviews, but also who is conceptualizing the study, because your book knowledge is valuable, of course, but then the practical piece is going to be really important as well.
And then the other question is about doing research with Indigenous people, and how is that different?
Yeah, that's a very important, that it's like a subgroup within Latinx immigrants, because you also have Indigenous languages that might be their first language. And so if you're going to be working with a Latinx immigrant population that is predominantly Indigenous, then you definitely want to make sure that you have somebody on your team that represents someone from that community.
Yeah. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And then there are so many comments about the respect and the ethics that people have to have in general working with Latinos, and respecting their cultural values. So I thank you very much. I don't know if somebody has one last question to ask. I think we have a couple of questions, although I know you have to run to a dissertation defense.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer one more.
Anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask the last question? I don't know if you're looking at the chat, but there is a lot of thank yous. And
oh, thank you.
really appreciating what you've presented today.
I'll be sharing the chat with you so that way you have it, Lizette.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
There's very helpful, and there were mentions that there are other efforts going on to try to educate the public that's working with Latino populations in St. Louis, I believe. So thank you so much for this presentation. It's been helpful to me as well. So I really appreciate it. And as you say, respeto is important always when you're working with people. And that respect shows in talking about usted or figuring out how people respect each other in different cultures. So thank you so much, Lizette. And we look forward to seeing you next year in Cambio de Colores in St. Louis.
Okay, take care.
Any other announcements, Veronica, that we need to do?
Thank you everyone for being part of this presentation. We'll have our last webinar tomorrow at the same time, 1:30 p.m. And it's political participation and policies in local, state, and national levels. We'll have 3 speakers presenting on different topics. So we hope to see you there tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.